It's not meant to be prescriptive, but it is meant to be supportive and, again, make sure that we're setting up these tiny house villages for success. And that is the ultimate goal.
That's the Seattle City Council's Maritza Rivera from earlier this week, putting the finishing touches on an ordinance to expand city-sanctioned encampments across Seattle. The council pushing back on this one a little bit with the mayor's office, to the point where there's been a bit of a shakeup in Mayor Katie Wilson's leadership team. We're learning about that, plus some new budget tricks, plans, depends on your point of view, but a lot of different options on the table as the city wrestles with a budget deficit. They're talking about a possible fire district. What would that look like? A bond measure for the Seattle Center? Well, all this and more this week on Seattle News, Views, and Brews, your coffee break political podcast. I'm Brian Callanan. I'm a host on the Seattle channel. The views expressed here are mine, and I am with my friend and co-host, David Croman of the Seattle Times. David, a reporting question here. Do you find the news gets slower around City Hall in the summer or quicker paced? Because I'm asking, it seems like things are actually kind of rocking right now for what is often sort of a languid time of year in local politics.
Yeah, I think it picks up because they spend the first few months figuring out what they're going to do, and then the next few months gearing up for it, and then the summer actually is when historically a lot of the actual legislating has been done. It's not exactly been the case necessarily in recent years, but I would say that it kind of just picks up as the year goes on. Yeah, I know they're trying to jam in a bunch of stuff before the budget, which we're going to be talking about in just a little bit. Thank you, David, as always. Thanks to our background noise sponsor, City Grind Espresso on the first floor of City Hall. John, good to see you last week. Thanks to our patrons. Mark, really great to have your input recently to help me with my recent interview with Councilmember Rink on the Seattle channel. And folks, if you want to be a patron, love to have you. Be a part of fighting the good fight on public affairs reporting. Help out at the $5 level or more, and you get access to Patrons First podcast. You can get this cool decal. It's all about the merch here, folks. Find Seattle News, Views, and Brews on Patreon. Help support the show. A shout out to Converge Media. The video version of the show is on Converge Wednesday nights at 7. And a big thank you to show sponsor, Phillips Law Firm. With an auto accident, you need more than an attorney. You need someone who knows your community. Phillips Law Firm's attorneys are your neighbors here to help. Call 1-800-JUSTICE or visit justiceforyou.com. Phillips Law Firm, unleashing justice for you. All right, time to do this thing. Time for Right Here, Right Now. Our top story this week, jumping back on the City Council's effort to refine the transitional encampment ordinance from the mayor's office. The full council voting on this week to increase the amount of encampments essentially in all the different neighborhoods of the city. First things first, there are some questions among the council, I know, on this front. David, when it comes to the speed of this legislation, Councilmember Kettle on Tuesday afternoon was calling for some restraint. Talk to me about this. Where is this ordinance going? What are you seeing here? It's interesting because there's sort of in principle, alignment between the mayor and the city council, which is, the mayor was pretty open during her campaign about, I think that we should be spending a lot of our time and energy on standing up emergency shelter. That was a bit of a shift, kind of away in some ways from the long-term permanent stuff. And, we got to be getting as many people off the streets as possible. And the council, I think for the most part, has seen how that message resonated pretty well and has understood that to the extent that Wilson has any sort of mandate, it's probably this. And I think for the most part, they've gotten behind that. But the process here, they've been really frustrated with. Pretty much from the beginning when Mayor Wilson introduced these 3 bills and she didn't seek out a sponsor on the council, that is a bit of a no-no because, well, first of all, there's the political piece of you need to make sure that your bills have support before they get down there so you don't get embarrassed by seeing your bills fail. But then also, not finding a sponsor, it just makes more work for the council president and members of the council. And, that's not really a good look for an administration that is trying to build rapport with the city council. But the tensions have really exploded since then because there had been, some push by members of Wilson's staff to pull amendments or hold amendments or even delay voting. And the perception on the second floor in council chambers was that Wilson and her staff as proxy was basically not respecting the separation of the council and the mayor's office. And they felt, frankly, disrespected by how they were being addressed.
Yeah, and we touched on that last week, and this has now spilled over into a shakeup in the mayor's office. Let's talk about this.
who is no longer working for the mayor exactly with the council here and why. I know it's inside baseball, but there's some important stuff going on here.
It is inside baseball, but Wilson swapped out her chief of staff, this person, Kate Burnett Cruiser. And that's notable for a few reasons. I mean, one, turnover is very common in the first year of any mayoral administration, but I don't have any memory of a chief of staff
a big one. Yeah.
Being bumped so quickly. You know, the other piece here is Mayor Wilson and Kate Burnett Cruiser are longtime friends. They've worked together forever. Cruiser was the treasurer of the Transit Writers Union, which, of course, Wilson founded. So these are two people that have personal connection here as well. But it's pretty clear that they didn't call it a demotion. It really is a demotion. It's pretty clear that her demotion is in direct response to the complaints from the council, because it was Cruiser's one of her jobs, to run council relations and interact with the council. And that was just not going very well. And so in her place, Esther Handy gets the job. And, you know, anyone who's been around City Hall knows the name Esther Handy. She's a veteran. She worked for Councilmember Mike O'Brien. She was the head of the council central staff. So that is the other piece here, is it's signaling, I think, to the council that, hey, I'm going to get someone in here who you know and respect and like. And then also she consolidated some council relations under Deputy Mayor Brian Surratt. That is another move. You know, Surratt is somebody who, as far as I can tell, has maintained a good relationship with the council. They seem to like working with him. And so I think this was a quick acknowledgement by Wilson that her office had kind of screwed this up and needed to do something more than, you know, I'd heard that she had offered some apologies, but that wasn't really breaking through, that the council didn't really want to hear it unless there was a real change. And here was a real change.
Yeah. And I guess just back on what Councilmember Kettle was saying about this, things like it's too important to get this wrong when it comes to addressing the homelessness crisis. He's asking for this idea to collaborate on a more comprehensive bill going forward. I'm just trying to figure out what this looks like, because I do think the council is in agreement. They want to make something happen here, but I still am sensing a little bit of a reservation in moving so quickly that there isn't enough community input, I guess, on this whole thing.
Yeah, the council wants a plan, and there isn't really one, not in any sort of meaningful way. I mean, so far what's happened is we get these little trickles. You know, we've got a site in Interbay, and here's a site here, and
50 people here, 60 people there, that kind of a thing.
There hasn't been a lot of forward looking, and I think, frankly, some of that is because I don't think the mayor's office, I think they're trying to do this on the fly. They were saying that they needed this new authority to directly sign leases before they could make real moves. But I think that's an uncomfortable place for this council to be in, to greenlight a process that they don't know where it's going. And they are much closer to people on the ground than the mayor is, because they are now district representatives. So if something goes wrong here, they're likely to be the ones to hear about it. So I think that's just making them uneasy, that they don't exactly know where this ship is headed, and they want to see that probably in writing. Whether or not that can be done and also build 1,000 shelter units this year or 4,000 over 4 years, that's the question. And, that was kind of Wilson's theory of the case, is we need to act like an emergency, and emergencies don't always have clear charted plans, but the council just, at least Councilmember Kettle and I think others, want to see a little more specificity.
That whole concept of building the plane at 30,000 feet is always a little bit of a challenge, I would have to say, for local governments. I want to move on to our next topic here with you here, David. The mayor and council also discussing some novel ideas to close what's going to be about a $150 million budget gap this year. Mayor Wilson inherited this structural budget problem from the last administration, is exploring some new possibilities here, including the establishment of a fire district to take some strain off the city's general fund. I read about this in Public Cola. I confirmed the city was working on this concept when I talked with Councilmember Rink last week on the Seattle channel. David, some thoughts about this. What would this look like? How would this fire district mechanism help and work?
Yeah, first, I guess it's important to note that fire districts are not totally abnormal. You see this a lot it tends to be a little more kind of rural areas. They have fire districts because, the general fund just doesn't support a full fire department. And so they break that off and then run separate tax measures to fund those fire districts.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'd be curious to know if there are other cities of Seattle size that have fire districts. The concept, though, is basically what you do is you're taking most or all, I don't know the extent of it, of the fire department's budget and splitting it off into its own kind of revenue source. And then you're asking the voters to approve the property tax hikes to fund that. The idea
and
being
Seattle did that with its parks a few years ago,
Yeah.
establishing a parks district. Keep going.
Yeah, that's the kind of most recent precedent here. At the end of the day, what it does is it frees up general fund money because, a lot of the general fund budget is eaten up by public safety. And so I guess the thought is if you break out the fire department, you gain a little more flexibility. And, at the end of the day, if you ask Seattle voters, will you fund the fire department? The answer is probably going to be yes. Mm-hmm. But when you boil it down, you can kind of use a lot of fancy government speak. But when you boil it down, what she's doing is asking people to raise property taxes on themselves to help fill the budget gap.
Yeah.
That's an approach. It's not a particularly progressive revenue. I mean, it's not sales tax, property taxes, but it's also not an income tax on people earning over $1 million or something like that. And I think the level of property taxes on people in Seattle has gotten to a point where voters are not turning against levies and property tax measures just yet. But I would say anecdotally, it feels like there's more grumbling out there. There's kind of more acknowledgement that property taxes are pretty high here. And, when you're talking about trying to make Seattle affordable, this would be another property tax hike if passed.
Yeah, and important to point out, the state legislature actually passed this measure earlier in this past session here to allow cities like Seattle to have this type of funding sort of source for different emergency services like that. I talked about that with Councilmember Rink last week. And just last touch on this, David, I've talked about this with you before, but I think I need to bring it up again. This idea of funding critical services. It doesn't get much more critical than the Seattle Fire Department, but doing that with dollars that are outside the city's general fund is a bit of a mind trick there. It takes me a while to get there, I think.
I'd say there's kind of the cynical explanation. The most cynical explanation is Seattle has grown beyond its means and is leaning on budget tricks to fund its basic services.
But other cities are going through this kind of thing too.
I was going to say the kind of broader, I don't know, not generous because it's not untrue, but explanation is that Washington State has this cap in place on property taxes at 1%. And as we all know, inflation lately has been a lot higher than 1%. So basically every year that passes, the property tax revenue for Seattle and particularly counties, but basically every location in the state is shrinking. Even though it increases, it's increasing less than inflation.
Yep.
And so therefore that property tax revenue is declining. And it is almost inevitable because, the release valve on that 1% property tax was always supposed to be levy lid lifts, as Seattle's done. And so Seattle has been doing that. But when you have this 1% cap in place for 20 plus years, that's a lot of years of basically shrinking revenue as when compared to inflation. And so therefore, we've seen a commensurate increase in levy lid lifts. It is sort of the reaping what the legislature has sown here to an extent, which isn't to say that Seattle couldn't be doing a better job of not relying on these to fund basic services, but it is kind of baked into the system to an extent.
All right, well, up next, folks, the clock is ticking on what could be the closure of the King County Regional Homelessness Authority. That story coming up on Now Hear This. A resolution passed late last week by the Seattle City Council sets forth a timeline on deciding whether or not the King County Regional Homelessness Authority needs to be shut down. We've discussed this on the podcast. The RHA had another financial audit that showed some serious problems a few weeks ago after years of these types of issues. And now the City Council is calling for a report on the KCRHA by the end of this week on some corrective actions to fix those problems, which the mayor and county executive will review and deliver a final decision on coming up on August 1st.
We want to be clear on when we're expecting information on how they're going to correct and evaluating if they can correct some of these challenges, and also starting to chart our course forward, our course moving forward as it relates to the status of all of these things, especially as we consider any type of restructuring or dissolution.
That was Councilmember Alexis Mercedes Rink talking to me about that issue last week on Seattle Channel. She was actually on her second meeting serving on the KCRHA's governing board when she learned about the results of this forensic audit. So a lot of concern there. David, the KCRHA already sent an initial report to the mayor's office a little while ago about some of the high-risk findings from the audit, I should say, as it was described. Publicola reported the mayor wasn't all that impressed by this. And I'm just kind of looking at these deadlines, especially at that one of August 1st. Is there anything the KCRHA can put together in a report that would have an impact on the mayor, that would have an impact on the county executive, that would preserve the agency in some way? I'm trying to ask that question about where this is going.
Yeah, I think the argument is going to be, I mean, because, this hasn't really been enough time passed to make significant systemic change. They could say, hey, we're in the process of, we want to hire a CFO. That was a big piece, is they didn't have a CFO. But I think probably a lot of it is going to be, hey, this audit includes a lot of years that we were not making sort of exerted effort to improve things, and we have, and we were making improvements when this came out, and we have continued with those improvements. Clearly, at least so far, that hasn't satisfied Mayor Wilson. Again, I've said this before, the strongest argument I've heard so far for keeping the KCRHA is that dissolving it would be more challenging than keeping it, which is not exactly a overwhelmingly positive endorsement of the KCRHA, but it is a devil you know versus devil you don't kind of an argument. So again, I think if it survives, it's not going to be because there's some suddenly convincing argument that it's working great. It's just going to be, you know what, we think it's worth it for us to put in the time and energy to fixing these things rather than take the risk of what might happen if we dissolve it.
Right, and that risk would be certainly more people who are unhoused getting into different issues there. They don't want that. The providers that are helping them out, they want to make sure that those providers stay whole as well. So I just keep hearing this phrase, restructuring or dissolution, when it comes to what's next for the KCRHA. Do you have any idea about what a restructured KCRHA might look like? Is there a way it could stick around in sort of an overhead role of some sort, coordinating the different contracts out there or something along those lines? Because I think there's a piece of it that could work, but then what it would actually look like restructured, it's just the brand is just it's really having a tough time right now.
Yeah. Councilmember Reagan Dunn compared it to the Boeing 737 and comments that President Trump had made about how you just got to rename the plane at this point. Right. His point being, you can do whatever you want here, but the KCRHA brand is permanently stained. So, I think the restructuring would look like you could probably quibble with what actually would happen on substance, but some kind of shuffling of the decks and then come out and say, hey, we're calling it the County Response to Homelessness That Will Solve Everything Association or whatever. Sure. And maybe that could kind of reset things to the point where they could make things right. Maybe you would have a little more kind of direct oversight from the city and county, kind of what the Public Health Seattle King County has. That body is similar to the KCRHA, but does have to actually, go before the city council and, has a line in the city's budget. And, so what exactly it looks like, I'm not sure. I assume that it probably would include a little more direct oversight from more elected lawmakers. Yeah. Though I've heard some people argue that was the problem in the first place, was that there were too many fingers in this pot. So it's I don't know what the path forward is.
Yeah. I heard Councilmember Rod Dembowski from the King County Council there talking about the KCRHA was a lot like the Titanic, and rather than trying to rearrange the deck chairs, you got to realize that the ship is going down. So interesting to see what happens there. A lot of great analogies put forth by our local leaders on this one for sure. But David, let me move on with you. I wanted to highlight a story you wrote in the Seattle Times recently about the Protect 17 union, the largest union of city workers. The city agreed last month to give about 300 workers retroactive raises to help settle an unfair labor practice complaint. But that hasn't happened, it sounds like, as of yet. The city would have to pay out somewhere in the range of $3 to $5 million from what I saw in your report, David. What's going on with this?
Yeah, it's a little inside baseball, I will acknowledge. But I like
that money. That money could be significant, though, in this budget.
The reason it matters is because it is real money, and I think labor and its strength will have a lot of implications for this upcoming, because they're about to enter contract negotiations again in the next few months, and how those come out will have significant implications for the budget. And of course, the budget is quite precarious right now, and part of the reason for that is that there have been continued pretty positive and strong raises for union members at a time when, other public sector unions weren't doing as well. So anyway, that's my pitch for why I think this is important. So this is this unfair labor practice complaint that has been floating around for a while that relates to the classification of certain engineers, and labor relations essentially agreed to settle this, which gave a bunch of engineers retroactive raises on the order of $5 million or so. But there has a lot of disagreement in city government around whether or not this person who signed the settlement should have actually signed it, or if the issues at play here were significant enough that it really should have waited until the bargaining table and gotten approval from the council and more kind of higher up lawmakers. And so what's happening now, though, is as one union official told me, is basically buyer's remorse, which is there are people in the city who seem to be exploring whether or not they can drag their feet on this or even reverse this settlement. And as a result, the raises have not gone out yet. And again, it's a little inside baseball, but it does kind of get at the tensions. I think there are some real tensions around particularly ProTech and its strength and the level of influence that it has in the city and what that means for the city's budget and what that will mean for upcoming contract negotiations. And this just seemed like a little bit of a slice of that.
For sure, yeah. And we had talked about ProTech a couple weeks ago, which represents the care teams that are out there on the street and how they have some concerns about how the SPOG contract, the rank and file police officers, how that's infringing upon the ProTech contract that the care teams have. So there are some definite important things to kind of pull back the cover on here. And I guess I'm looking at this, the Labor Relations Committee within the City Council, we don't often hear a ton about it. I'm not going to say that it doesn't exist and they don't have reports on it, et cetera, but it's not something that always rises to the surface. And I noticed in your piece, too, this idea, at least one of these union officials was saying the city needs a Department of Labor Relations to handle these kind of things. Do you think that's true? Does there need to be another level of government to try to help deal with these labor relations issues?
Yeah, it's interesting. Again, it's hard to kind of parse this out without getting into some really weedy inner city politics here, because there's a perception. Basically, I think what the unions really want is a labor relations team that is more directly accountable and reporting to the mayor rather than some of the higher ups in the human resources department. Because by their calculations, you've got Mayor Katie Wilson. Basically, every mayor who's running City Hall is going to be extremely pro-labor. Bruce Harrell was, Mayor Wilson is. And so by their calculations, if they could get a labor relations team that has to go back and report to the mayor, they didn't put it in exactly these terms, but it seems pretty clear that they think they could move more quickly and probably get a better deal if that's who the team is reporting to, rather than their perception of the human resources department is that it is basically not particularly pro-labor and that it is less flexible. So, I think there's some real concerns about how well staffed the labor relations department is at the city and its ability to actually navigate and negotiate this really complicated contract that's going to come up. That's real, I think, and worth raising. I think also at the same time, the unions have some ulterior motives here to create a line of reporting that would probably be more friendly to them.
Understood. Thank you for bringing up that story. That's some interesting stuff there. All right, well, coming up, another interesting budgetary plan that could be the center of attention in a few months, in more ways than one. That story coming up on What's Next? David, we touched on this idea a few months ago on the podcast, but now it looks like it's in the works and it's going to happen, a bond measure to support Seattle Center. What's going on here? And let's please help our listeners understand how a bond measure is different than a levy, whenever you can. Go ahead.
Yeah. So, yes, the Councilmember Rob Saka and Mayor Wilson have, in sort of the most formal way yet, come out in favor of a ballot measure to fund and repair Seattle Center. That is as pretty much as detailed as we've gotten so far.
Okay.
So, just some context. Seattle Center and its backers have been pushing pretty hard for a ballot measure that they would want to see in the $1.3 to $1.5 billion range.
Yeah.
They think that would go a long way towards fixing some of the unsexy stuff like HVAC systems and electrical and plumbing, while also funding, pretty big overhaul of the Armory building and maybe some other buildings.
Yeah.
Rob Johnson, former council member Rob Johnson, who's now the head of the Seattle Center Foundation, has really, really, really wanted this to go on the 2026 ballot. It's going to be a good ballot because it's going to be huge turnout. It gets the ball moving. They don't have to really compete with other city priorities. Yeah. This resolution backs a bond. It says we support a bond, which is different than a straight property tax levy. It's basically a loan. The city would be taking out a loan that they would then have to repay with some new funding source. The new funding source would be a bump in property taxes. Yep. It has to only go towards capital expenditures, which
Right.
for Seattle Center is not a problem. That's really all they want. And then it needs 60% of the vote. That's the kind
the
of
big one.
risky.
Yeah.
That's the political risky piece, is it needs 60%. They feel pretty confident they could get that. Polling has been overwhelmingly positive. So, that's interesting. I think the kind of real wrinkle here, though, is this resolution seems to suggest that we're looking probably more like a 2027 for this ballot measure rather than 2026. That is not what Rob Johnson and the Seattle Center backers would prefer, because again, that's an off-year election. You're not going to have as good turnout. I think for a measure like this, the more turnout, the better. They still feel pretty good, though, about 2027. The risk, though, is if it goes beyond 2027, then you start running into, Pike Place Market would like a levy. There's the possibility of a levy for, say, replacing the fire department headquarters or building a new police station. And then if you go even a year or two after that, then the housing levy is going to expire, then the transportation levy, then the education levy. So there is a time limit here. The big thing, not to get too tangled in the weeds here, but the big thing with a bond, though, is it does not eat into the city's limit on property tax increases. That is another big selling point of why they would go with a bond. So, a lot of moving pieces here. I think it is notable, though, that this is for the first time an endorsement. We knew that Mayor Harrell backed this proposal. This is the first time we have seen kind of a in writing official endorsement from Mayor Wilson saying, I support this, go forth and give me a proposal. It's just the extent of what that looks like and when is still pretty unclear.
Right. And it sounded like there was a philanthropic giving piece to this as well. Hopefully, with this bond, there would be some philanthropic giving in addition. Can you talk about that piece? And are people willing to give and match these dollars? I mean, we're talking about a lot of money here, potentially.
People are willing to give. And the Seattle Center Foundation has this $100 million goal already. They will probably meet that. Councilmember Saka, who is in charge of the committee that oversees Seattle Center, is saying he would like to see a 1-to-1 match or even a 2x or 3x match on this. Rob Johnson has said in so many words that is not going to happen. You're not going to, if you're going to put $1 billion levy on the ballot, you're not going to find $1 billion in private money. Johnson's argument was, look, the whole reason we're doing this is because there has been huge private investment into Seattle Center for many years.
Right.
Climate Pledge, KXP, McCaw Hall, MoPop. This isn't private investment, but a lot of money from Seattle Public Schools for Memorial Stadium. So his argument is the private side has already been doing a lot here. Now is the time for us to have a public investment into this campus. I don't know whether Councilmember Saka's demand for a 1-to-1 match is going to be a deal breaker on this. He sounded pretty convinced of it when I talked to him. But again, I just, as far as what's realistic, anything over $100 million, I think you're starting to stretch.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for that, David. Do need to wrap up with you. Got to talk about the Mariners, of course. I'm going to leave the Luis Castillo going to the bullpen thing on the side for a little bit. That's going to be weird, but I just wanted to focus on the star prospect, Colt Emerson, called up to the big leagues. His first hit is a home run. What are your expectations for Emerson this year? Because I got to say, it looked like he just waved it at that pitch, and he hit it out. A line shot home run there. If he keeps that up, the M's are going to be in great shape. What do you think?
Yeah, I went to the game on Sunday. It was his first game.
Oh, killer, man.
I didn't know it was going to be his first game until like a few hours beforehand.
Yeah, and his parents didn't either, apparently.
He walked, I think, and the whole game was pretty bad. But I will say we had really good seats on the third base line, and watching him just field a ground ball and throw it, even next to other professional athletes, that's a guy who just moves really well. And you can tell his athleticism from a long distance. So, I'm excited to see what he can do.
That's awesome. Bring a 20-year-old into the mix. Some good things can happen. We'll see what happens there. Thank you, David. Thanks to everybody listening to Seattle News, Views, and Brews, where you can always find out what's brewing in local politics. Become a patron. Check out Seattle News, Views, and Brews on Patreon. Pledge $5 per month or more. Thank you for the help. Great to have you listening to this podcast on Apple, Spotify, wherever you might tune in. Thailand, once again, pulling ahead as our top listening country outside of the U.S., thanks to that country as well. Thanks also for watching on Converge Media. We'll see you next time.
Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2026.